Hi, I'm Nick Baker. Let's look at some ways to add selective focus and retouch an image with some advanced layer options in Photoshop. So I'm going to start with this picture of a fungus that I took, and there's a couple things I want to change. For one thing, there's the edge of a shovel sticking into the frame, and I want to get rid of that. And then you could see the depth of field captures the fungus, but not this background. This was a little closer, and so it's in focus, and I want to make this blurry too, just like this side. So let's take this into Photoshop, and we're going to start by retouching to get rid of that shovel. The first thing I want to do, actually, before I retouch, is I'm going to make a copy of this background layer by dragging it right onto the new layer, and we're going to call this Retouched. I'm actually going to be making changes to the image, and I want to keep them. So there are a couple different ways to retouch the image. The two main ones are this Band-Aid tool, or the spot healing brush, and the clone stamp tool. So let's start with the Band-Aid tool. I'm going to make my Band-Aid brush a little bit soft, just to feather the edges. And now let's draw all over. You can see it sort of grays out where I've drawn this thing that I want to get rid of. And it uses some computer algorithms to try and fill in that space with stuff from around it. So you can see there's some grass blades that come in, and it actually duplicated this little stick. And maybe I want to hide that, so now I can do some fine tuning with the clone stamp. So the clone stamp is nice. If you press the Option key, you can select a target area, so maybe down here, and then it lets you paint with that from that target area directly into your image. So if I go like this, you can see the little cross is showing where it's getting that alternative image from. So that's great, but now if we compare it to the original, you can see there's still the shadow of the shovel in there. So let's get rid of that with a layer, adjustment layer. So I'm going to go into adjustments, and I'm going to choose, where is it? My exposure. So I want to push the exposure up a little bit, and I'm going to push the gamma correction down. And so now we can see that this maybe mostly better matches. But let's isolate that area to see even better. So if I select the layer mask and say Command I to invert it, now it's not showing anywhere, but I can take my paintbrush tool and flip it over to white. And now, if I make it a little bigger, I can actually draw and show that adjustment layer right through. You can see it's mostly good. There's a little shadow still there. If I go back to the adjustments, double click there, I can push the exposure up even more, or the gamma sort of gets rid of those, and the exposure down a little bit. So you can play with it until you get it right where you want it, and so it doesn't show or stand out too much. I'm going to go back into this mask because there are a few little blades of grass that stand out. I'm going to shrink my paintbrush way down, and let's push those back to black so that we don't have the effect. Now that's even a little bit too dark, so I'm going to undo, and I'm going to change the opacity of my paintbrush down to about 50%, and this will let me apply sort of half of my adjustment layer, and then if I click again, it gives me more and more. So that, I think, is pretty good. Let's turn this background into a layer. Right click and say Layer from Background. We'll give it a name. Let's call it Original. And I'm going to drag it up on top of these other layers so that I can see the original, and now if I hide it, I can immediately compare it with all of my other layers. So, assuming I'm happy with this, and let's say I am, now we're going to go and adjust this bottom corner because we want to make it a lot more blurry. So we're going to grab another copy of this retouched layer. We're going to drag it down to new layer to duplicate it, and I'm going to double click and rename it blurred so I can keep track of everything. So I'm going to put it on top of this adjustment layer because we don't want it to actually have that adjustment applied. And now I'm going to add a layer mask to it so I can see just this corner, but I can see the underlying stuff for everything else. So I'm going to use this lasso tool, which is nice. If I click here and click here, you can see it's letting me make a selection, double click there, and now it closes itself. So I've got a triangle. If I click the new mask button, add a layer mask, it'll automatically use that selection. And so if I turn off these underlying layers, you can see I'm only looking at this layer. So now I can go into the layer itself, not the mask, but the layer itself. And I'm going to use a Gaussian blur. So we go up to Filter, Blur, Gaussian or Gaussian blur. And you can see if preview is checked and I turn the radius of the blur way down, it's pretty sharp. If I turn the radius way up, it's completely blurred out. So I want to find that sweet spot where it sort of matches this blur. So I'm going to push it down, 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 down. So that looks pretty close, about 6 pixels. Similar level of blur, and I'll say OK. But now, of course, I've got more blurred than I want, right? Because I made this layer mask rather quickly. So I'm going to go into the layer mask and tweak it using my paintbrush again, and I want it back to 100%. I'm going to make right bracket a little bigger. And so now I can paint, and as I'm painting, you can see I'm painting out that blurred area. And come down here. Sometimes you want to zoom in a little bit to get really precise adjustments. So I'm going to go along here. But then, of course, this is in the background. I've done a little too much. Shrink down a little bit to get finer and switch to white. And now I'm going to paint back over this area that I do want to be blurry. Come up in here. I can see this little thing is still blurrier than I want. And the rest of this area is still nice and sharp. Now the last thing to look at, now that I've got my little blur area, is I want to make it lighter to match this side. So I'm going to use another adjustment layer, hop over here and say brightness contrast. And if we push the brightness up a little bit, maybe the contrast down slightly, a little bit more brightness. I'm doing it roughly until I can have this sort of where I want, but it's hard to compare with the other side. So what I want to do is actually use the same mask for the blurring as I do for the brightness, because I want to hide the same things and only affect this corner. So the way to do that is to press the Option key, and then I'm going to drag this mask right onto the other mask. It wants me to know, do I want to replace the mask? Yes, I really do. So now they have the same mask, and my brightness and contrast only applies to this area of the image. And now I can do any fine tuning that I want to do. I can make it even brighter or not quite so bright. Push the contrast back and forth until it's more or less where I want it to be. So that's an easy way to add selective focus and do a little retouching. And you can compare it back to the original and see those subtle changes.